Welcome to a Wonder Junkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, Anil, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Ryan. Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been really enjoying your writing and hearing you speak about the nature of consciousness. So it'll be fun to explore consciousness together through cyberspace. It's nice to meet you this way. I've really loved the way you've been articulating the nature of consciousness, and I wanted to expose you to as many people as I can. I think it's important stuff. And it looks like your TED Talk, one of them got 15 million views, and your book's been read by many, so it's spreading faster than we could even imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I've been very surprised and kind of delighted by that. TED Talks always get quite a lot of reach, but 15 million is a number that still doesn't make much sense to me in terms of, how other things we do in academia, what their kind of reach and impact is. But I'm also glad that the book has been read widely too, because that's obviously contains a lot more content than a 15-minute TED Talk.
Yeah, it's amazing that we can share ideas this fast in this day and age. I would love to just hear a little bit of overview of how you got so obsessed, and at what age did you start exploring consciousness and getting so inspired to go down this avenue?
Well, I think, there's that old thing about life only being understood backwards, but having to be lived forwards from Soren Kierkegaard. And, I feel that too very strongly. I didn't expect to be doing this. I think everybody, probably not everybody, many people are fascinated by consciousness at some point. I think when you grow up as a kid, there's points at which you realize that you are a person and a different person from other people, and there's the recognition that at some point you will die, and what happens then, and where were you before you were born, and then the questions, for me anyway, questions started arising, like do I have free will? What's going on? But at that point, it was never something that I thought I would be making a career out of. And when I started studying in the 1990s in undergrad, it was originally in physics and then in psychology. Consciousness research wasn't really a thing. And I ended up going off in different directions, but somehow I always kept coming back. And I think I was really very fortunate that through the 1990s and early 2000s, this, in the wider context of academia, was when consciousness research began to regain some of its lost legitimacy. You could find other people doing it. You could find interesting projects. We have brain imaging becoming more widely used. So suddenly there were opportunities where a decade earlier there hadn't been. And so I think it was a combination of these things. But it wasn't really until my postdoc, so having done a PhD, and then now about 24 years ago, I went to live in San Diego in the US. And that was when I first really focused on consciousness.
That's amazing. And now, what would you say that you have as an actual fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness? Is there anything for certain? I always think like I'm alive, I'm having some sort of experience, so something's happening from nothing. So I'm always just grateful for the fact that I'm inside of some sort of very weird experience. But I don't know what it is. Is that the baseline for existence? Is that what you think? Or tell me a little bit about what you've discovered.
Certainty is a high bar, isn't it? And so, especially in science, where we really should. Things are always provisional, but they can, being provisional can bring you very, very close to certainty for many things. We're not going to find out that the Earth is in fact flat. It's round, but exactly what kind of round, we don't know. There's always some kind of uncertainty. With consciousness, the situation is in some sense a little bit harder. One of the big challenges or the two big challenges for consciousness research, one is kind of theoretical or philosophical, that it's very hard to know what it even means to say that conscious experiences depend on the brain or relate to the world of physics in some way. And this is what David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. How do we think about the relationship between the experiences that we have, the redness of red, the sharpness of a pain, and atoms, molecules, quarks, fields, whatever is actually out there in the world as physics tells us. And of course, philosophically, there are all positions about this. There's consciousness is fundamental, consciousness is the only thing, or matter is fundamental and consciousness is a property. I don't think we can be certain about any of those big metaphysical positions, but perhaps what we can be certain about is the fact that consciousness is real. Some philosophers will possibly tell you we're mistaken about that too, but for me, that's my starting point at least. I'm going to just buy into that and say, look, the one thing I can be sure of is that right here, right now, consciousness is happening somehow, because everything else for me is known only indirectly, but consciousness is direct.
And so I've heard you mention having a controlled hallucination and that it's a feedback loop. And I've heard many philosophers like Robert Anton Wilson talk about this interacting processing and how life itself is this continuous process. It's a living experience of some sort, but that's the human interpretation of consciousness. And that's all we ever really truly have. So we don't really know, does the earth have consciousness? I know it gets weird when you start to have the philosophical conversation around it, but me as an average person in society that's not in the academic circles, I like to try to get to the root of suffering because I've seen it as a first responder for 20 years. And I always think like, all right, there's something tangible that makes me obsessed with understanding the nature of consciousness so I can at least have some compassion and some understanding for maybe people in the streets who have schizophrenia and things like that. But then it leads you immediately to wondering, you know, what is a dolphin's consciousness? They seem so hyper intelligent, or anything that is in the ocean. And there's so many things that seem much smarter and more interesting than us,
Yeah, it's this kind of human exceptionalism, isn't it, that I think has plagued our species for a long time, of thinking of ourselves as above and beyond, and in particular, much better than, superior than other creatures. And there is something distinctive about humans as organisms, and probably also about human experiences, the kinds of conscious experiences that we have. But you're right, they're not the only ones. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote about 50 years ago now a very influential philosophy paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And one of the points he makes in that, among many, is that, well, we humans will never know what it's like for a bat to be a bat, with their echolocation and all their strange and wonderful ways of interacting with the world. But for the bat, there is something it is like to be a bat. There is a world, there is an experience happening for the bat. And we can learn about it. We just can't have that experience. I think that's one of the real challenges for consciousness research right now. This is one of the front lines, if you like, that we're starting to go beyond studying consciousness where we're pretty sure it exists, which is in sort of other human beings who aren't severely brain injured, or before they're born or something like that, and asking more questions about the distribution of consciousness. Where else in the world do we find it? As you said, some people say it's everywhere, like the earth is conscious, or maybe molecules are conscious, or something like that. And I find those positions, they might be right, but I find them a bit difficult to engage with. We don't have evidence, and it's not clear that we have a good theoretical grasp on that kind of thing. But to me, it does make sense to ask about non-human animals, dolphins, other mammals. But then what about fish? What about insects? What about bumblebees? What about octopuses? These creatures are different from human beings. It's much harder to take what we know about the mechanisms of consciousness in human brains and apply that knowledge when we get so far separated on the tree of evolution from these other creatures. But we're beginning to make some progress, because I think the more we learn about consciousness where it does exist, the better we are able to generalize, because the more we understand what is true about consciousness in general and what happens to be the case about consciousness just for human beings.
Yeah, I'd love to hear you describe your, I guess it's a theory on this controlled hallucination that we are all having at some level, and how you came up with that. I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense when you describe it.
And of course, the question is, does it actually make sense as a theory? And that's the nice thing about this business. Lots of ideas can sound nice, but then they don't stand up. But let's see. So the idea, anyway, it's not a new idea. It's quite an old idea. I'm just using it maybe in a slightly different way. So the brief take on it goes something like this. It's really a theory not of what is the magic thing that makes the difference between, let's say, a non-conscious rock and a conscious person, but it's a theory about, given that we are conscious, we have conscious experiences, how do we understand their character? And in this sense, it's initially a theory of perception, of how do our brains make sense of the world and the body. And the basic idea is that instead of the brain just passively receiving information about the world through the eyes and the ears and painting some kind of internal picture of what the world is like and what the body is like, the brain is instead always making predictions about what's out there in the world and what's in here in the body, the state of the body's internal physiology. And the sensory information that it gets, because if you think about it, the brain is really, it's locked away in this bony vault of a skull where it's dark, it's silent, and all the brain has to go on are these electrical signals. The sensory signals that it gets are used to update, calibrate the brain's predictions, keep them geared to the world and the body. And this is really the core claim, that what we experience is not a readout of the world from the outside in, but it's an active construction, the brain's best guess about what's out there in the world or in here in the body. And that's a kind of flip from how people often think about perception, which is as information marching deeper and deeper into the brain from the senses and being read out in some way. No, I think it's the opposite.
That's
the
fascinating.
basic idea. And then the extensions basically take that to the body and to say, well, the self is not the thing that does the perceiving or the experiencing. The experience of being a self, of being you, Ryan, or of being me, Anil, is itself a kind of perception. So it's another kind of brain-based best guess. It's a construction. It's a process, right? It's not an internal, non-changing essence. So there's a different way to think about the nature of selfhood here as well.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like 5 different modes of self, if you will. I don't know how the languaging was, but you can be basically the actor, the director, and I'm using different words, of course, and throwing them out there. The observer, just these weird modes. Yeah, I'm using completely different language. I forget your 5, but it sounded like that. It sounded like these different, like if you're laying in a meditative state, you start to see these different modes of self, and the introspection gives you that, but you don't really have the words for it. And you seem to have come up with a few.
Well, I think that there are many ways to cut the cake when it comes to the self. Meditation is actually a very good way to come to the same sorts of realizations. I think people who've meditated a lot, and this does not include me, by the way, but people who have come to experience in their meditative practice that the self is this kind of construction. It's composed of many different parts. It's always changing. It gives you a sort of experience of what's happening in the brain under the hood that creates this apparently colorful, full of sound, objective world of reality around us. And when it comes to the self, the important thing here is just the recognition that it's not one thing, that there's many kinds of experience that contribute to our overall experience of being who we are. I think the terms that I use, there's at the lowest level, there's what I would call the bodily self, the experience of just this particular object, my hands that I'm holding in front of me now. Well, I experience that as part of me. It's an object in the world, but that feels like part of me. That can't be taken for granted. The brain is always figuring out what in the world is part of the body and what isn't. And I'm sure, in your career as a first responder, you'll see cases where people's bodies are changing quite dramatically, and the brain's trying to figure out, well, what's happened to the body. Emotion is a big part of this too. Emotion is a central part of the experience of being a self. It's not part of the world, it's part of you, part of me. And then we have experiences of seeing the world from a first-person perspective, which is, again, is very easy to take for granted. But it's something the brain is always trying to figure out. Where am I in relationship to the body and the world? And only after that do you get to these aspects of self that we might talk about in a more everyday sense. Like, I have free will. I decide to do things or of my own volition. That's something people like to say. That's a part of self. And then finally, there's the name. I'm Anil. I have memories and plans for the future. And that sense of identity is also part of the self. So all of these aspects of self are typically experienced all bundled up together as one. But what we know from psychiatry, from neurology, from experiments as well, is that they can come apart. And the brain is always weaving together these different elements into this apparently unified experience of being the person that you are.
Yeah. And I hear you mention the brain a lot, it makes sense. You're a neuroscientist. But have you come across Michael Levin?
Oh, yes. Yes, he's a friend and colleague. He's a wonderful biologist. Yeah.
My gosh, he blows my mind when he describes the way he thinks about consciousness. And he actually says that we as a species give too much emphasis on speaking about the brain because he's more developmental biology coming from that biophysics land. And he talks a lot about single-celled organisms and then being an embryo, and that it's like, at what point do we have consciousness emerge, if not the whole way through in a different way? So I don't know. Could you describe a little bit about what you think about the differences are with some of his ideas and yours?
Well, I'll tell you where I think our ideas align. And this is what what he and I talk about sometimes. We disagree about some things, but it's always in an interesting way. So what Mike's work, one of the things it's revealing is how amazing and dynamic biological stuff is, whether it's a single cell or even part of a cell or a group of cells. The material of life is capable of so much stuff, so much dynamical and functional potential to self-organize, to do complex things. He has these wonderful xenobot and anthrobot creations where cells from frogs or even from the back of a human throat can self-organize together and start doing stuff they've never done in their evolutionary history. And there's all kinds of things happening. There's worlds of metabolic activity. There's electric fields. There's so much happening just in the kind of stuff that we're all made of. And this may sound like nothing new. Of course, biologists who study cells talk about this kind of thing all the time. But what Mike is really showing is how it's just looking at the raw potential of the stuff of biology. And one reason I think this is super important is because it shows the poverty of focusing too much on the brain, and especially treating the brain as a kind of computer. And here's the central point for me. I think in neuroscience and in a lot of research on consciousness, historically, we've tended to fall a little bit too far into the metaphor of the brain as a computer and as doing information processing, and that consciousness is just a matter of finding the right kind of software program that the wetware of the brain is running. And this is why people talk about consciousness in artificial intelligence, because if you literally think the brain is a computer and that consciousness is a property of the algorithms that the brain is running, well, of course, then in principle, you could run the necessary and sufficient algorithms for consciousness in something made of silicon. And that's what computers, they're very good at running algorithms. That's why we have them. But the more you look at real brains and real biology, the more you realize how different they are from computers. And these differences make a difference. Like in a computer, you have this sharp separation between the hardware and the software That's what makes computers useful. That's why they run algorithms, because algorithms depend on the software, not on the hardware. But brains aren't like that. Now, evolution didn't care about separating our mindware from our wetware so that we could like run PowerPoint in our visual cortex. It's not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
We don't find that separation. And what's more, when you look at the richness of what biological stuff can do, as Mike Levin does, and you compare that with, the dead sand of silicon, they're worlds apart. Silicon is so good at doing some things, but it's not very good at doing the kinds of things that biological matter does. So I think we need to stop forcing the brain too much through this lens of thinking of it as a computer and just thinking of all this wonderful, rich biological business as just one way of implementing some algorithm. I think we miss the game if we do that.
Yeah, it keeps us limited, and it keeps us from being able to think deeper and ask better questions and get outside of the little metaphors that we've basically created from our own limited imagination thus far. So we can only really see the things that we've got in front of us. And so we seem to compare consciousness to the very limited tech that we've created. But hopefully, I think philosophy will somewhat always exist, right, when it comes to thinking about the nature of consciousness.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, this is one reason it's fascinating, right? I don't think it's going to stop being a philosophical issue. I've been wondering recently about a situation where we actually, in some sense, solve consciousness scientifically, in the sense that we have a theory that predicts when and where it would happen and why we have this experience and not that experience. What then? You might think, well, job done, but no, not job done. Philosophically, there are still enormous issues to grapple with. Will that feel like a satisfactory explanation to us? What do we do with it? What should we do with it? Philosophy is relevant not only in the sort of the very basic assumptions we make about whether consciousness is everywhere in the universe or not, but it's incredibly relevant in the everyday as well, the ethics, the moral implications, the practical implications. And I think a healthy science of consciousness depends on this healthy, robust interaction between philosophically trained scientists and scientifically trained philosophers.
Yeah, and how fast tech is growing right now at like this exponential rate. It's almost more important now than ever to have the philosophical, moral compass or things that we can consider implementing into the baseline of how we're programming it. Because the transhumanist movement, some of them think that it's going to save us, and they're giving it so much power. And I'm like, I don't think it's appropriate to approach it this way.
Yes, I think the rapid acceleration in tech and especially AI it's very exciting in many ways. I mean, there are many great opportunities here, many great things that can be done. But yeah, it's kind of destabilized the discussions a little bit because it's changed so fast. And there's this now very outsized influence of the tech community for very obvious reasons. There are a lot of ethical discussions, of course, within the tech community. I mean, they do deal with the ethics to some extent, but it is hard to keep pace. And you do, to my mind anyway, I do come across sort of ideas which I think are, a little bit lacking in their feasibility or even moral desirability, like this whole business about uploading yourself to the cloud. Okay, well, really, is that feasible? Well, again, if the brain is a computer, then yes. But if it isn't, then absolutely not. It's not going to happen. And what about the kind of the ethics and morals of doing this anyway? There's a lot of problems with these kinds of transhumanist and techno-optimist and almost techno-rapture perspectives. On the other hand, a real, for me, it adds urgency to understanding the kinds of minds that we ourselves have, so that we avoid the temptation to project them too easily into our machine creations.
Yeah, and I heard in your TED Talk, I think you said, we are a part of nature, we're not apart from nature in that way of, and then you seem to end it with, there's nothing to be afraid of when consciousness ends. And I think that is the core of what's driving this transhumanist religious movement. I call it a religion in a way, because it has this fear of death. Like when you listen to Kurzweil and all these guys, I think that at the core, it's almost like that book Ernest Becker wrote, The Denial of Death, is what's driving it. And this fear is at the core of what we create as human beings, and this inability to just surrender and trust the process, or whatever you want to come up with as your relationship to the nature of consciousness. And until you make peace with that, it seems to drive everything at this. It's almost a righteous religious movement, in my opinion. I'm probably far off, but
yeah. Well, I think that, I mean, there's a lot in common, right? There is this the promise of immortality, in some sense, has been a central offer of many religions. There's even this element of rapture in the singularity. A time in history where something big happens, and the true believers live forever, and those who don't are left behind in some sort of post-singularity wasteland, or I don't know, maybe still a nice place, whatever. But there are a lot of features of a religion, and and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing to have beliefs in things, and that's fine. But equally important, as you suggested, is really to come to terms with who and what we are, to realize that we are part of nature and not apart from nature. And that's not necessarily easy. I don't know if I was. It's very hard to come to terms with the idea for each of us that at some point we will not exist. But for me, I think that's important work to be done on ourselves. And the phrase about suffering that you picked up, I think, is an important one. When consciousness does end, again, with the necessary dose of bit of humility and uncertainty, because we don't actually know, but it seems very, 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 very likely that that's it. And there is just the absence of experience. But in that absence of experience, I think there is some comfort to be had, because the absence of experience is the absence of any kind of experience. It's also the absence of suffering. And maybe that's all we need.
Yeah, I think it's nice to, like you said, keep the humility factor there. And the more you can really admit to the truth, which is that we don't know what the hell's going on. We don't know what any of it is, and we don't know how we got here or where we're going. That's an actual beautiful thing. I think it's the mystery, to me, is where the beauty is. And I think that's one of the big roots of suffering as a species, is the clinging to what we think we know and then imposing it upon other people or onto the planet itself. Or I think the righteousness has really gotten us into the most trouble.
But I think we also have to be a bit careful. There's a temptation, and this can happen in the interaction between science and society in general, which is, you often hear scientists being too certain about their statements, whether it's the efficacy of a COVID vaccine or whatever it might be. Because there's this fear that if you introduce a little bit of doubt, then it gets interpreted as we don't know anything. All possibilities are equally likely. There's just like believe whatever you want. And of course, that's not true either. To say there is a systematic and necessary humility and doubt to most things that's most statements that come out of science is not to say that anything goes at all. So yes, nobody knows for sure what happens to consciousness after death, but it's not that all options are equally likely. I think we know enough, and not just from science. A lot of religious and spiritual traditions will say this too, that the individual does not continue after death. We have plenty of evidence from cases of brain damage from anesthesia and so on, where, yeah, consciousness can go away. And when the brain stops, consciousness seems to stop. What does that actually mean in terms of, if consciousness is fundamental, maybe it's, you as an individual, Ryan, stop, I am as an individual, Anil, stop, but consciousness itself doesn't. Who knows? But the idea that the experience of being me, Anil Seth, does not stop, somehow continues when my brain stops. I'm pretty sure that that's wrong, that I stop when my brain stops. That's not, tiny bit of humility there, but it's a very, very small level of residual doubt.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that feedback for sure. It's almost like, I guess, the nature of consciousness and before death and after death, those are the two good starting points for that humility to stick around. But after that, you can come up with a lot of truth, and discover what we do know about the nature of life and the nature of consciousness or the nature of suffering. Or there's a lot to be not clung to, but we need to have truth. There is truth. It's just that the giant existential truth, I think, drives us in a lot of neurosis and a lot of issues, and it creates a lot of problems. But
that's interesting. I wonder how true that is. I mean, I guess this is something that's often said, right? That religion can give you the certainty that can be the opium of the masses, all that kind of stuff. Personally, I find some amount of existential uncertainty quite appealing. I find that in itself quite comforting. That beyond our sphere of understanding and knowledge, there's who knows what. I personally find that not a difficult place to be with.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel the exact same way. That's why I'm like, why are people so set on having the answer, the big answer? And it's like, well, how about it just gets to be more and more interesting?
Yes.
I like the curiosity and the wonder and the awe and the mystery, because it keeps getting weirder and more interesting, and we discover more and more about it. So it's an expansive process, not a reductionist process.
Yeah, the questions change, and the questions could become more interesting. And I think the other side of the coin goes back to a theme you've rightly brought up a few times, which is suffering. And if on this journey, we find new ways to alleviate suffering, both in our human family, but more broadly in the world, then there's merit in that too. There's a lot of merit. So for me, the powerful thing about studying consciousness is that you have both things going on. It addresses the deep existential questions that we have, but it has the day-to-day practical relevance of helping address problems in psychiatry and neurology, but also in everyday life, so that we can live better lives.
Yeah. And anesthesia would probably be the best example of that, because we're so lucky to have lived in a time, this slice of time right at the end of the human evolution, where we're like, oh, I can get surgery. I've had multiple surgeries over the years on my foot, and I don't know what the heck's going on with anesthesia. I don't even think the anesthesiologists do. It's still quite a mystery, but thank God we discovered it, because we need surgeries. And oh my gosh, just 100 years ago and beyond that, it would have just been horrible,
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Sometimes people ask you, like, what period of history you would like to live in.
Now.
And for me, there's always that caveat. It's like, well, it might be interesting back in 100,000 years ago, or whenever, or even in the Renaissance or something. But like, hold on a minute, they didn't have anesthesia or decent dentistry.
Exactly.
That's a big problem for me. So it might be a nice place to visit in between medical appointments, but to actually go back there permanently, I'm not so sure about that at all. But you're right. Anesthesia is it's something to be so grateful for. I think it can lay pretty good claim to being one of the most important inventions of the last 100, 200 years.
Yeah.
And nobody does know exactly how it works, but it does work.
Yeah, it's amazing. What is memory to you? How do you describe what memory is?
Memory is like, the annoying answer is that it depends. It's many things, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's, yes, I remember what I had for breakfast. It's this very autobiographical sequence of events that we feel like we collect in some kind of mental file drawer but we keep losing things from it and so on. That might be a little bit what it feels like. But I don't think it's a better metaphor for me, even of this kind of autobiographical memory, is something like water running down the face of a glacier. So the memory would be the patterns, the grooves in the ice. And when water goes down the grooves, it recreates that pattern. But it also melts the ice a little bit again. So the pattern changes, which is to say each time you remember something, it's not like accessing a file on a computer where you expect and rely on it to have that the act of opening a file does not itself change the file. That is demonstrably untrue for human memory. Every time we remember an event, the memory changes. And that's just one kind of memory, but there are many others too. If you learn a sport or a musical instrument, we learn a skill, and we may not know what we've learned. We just become able to do something that we couldn't do before. That's another kind of memory. Memory is very basic, very fundamental. It's just the kind of how patterns retain some stability over time. Anything that does that, that's a kind of memory.
Yeah. And it's weird to think of like Dawkins, the memes and genes idea, where we come through and we have all this hardware memory, and then we have this new downloadable memory, and they combine to create something new, an emergent phenomena, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's possibly one of the more human distinctive aspects of the way our minds work, is its ability to combine things together in new ways. And people study non-human animals for these kinds of things and show certain amount of ability of this kind in developing new tools, like crows learning to fish for worms with sticks, and other primates learning to figure out how to use things lying around to do various things. But we have to tread this fine line between human exceptionalism and thinking of ourselves as too special and too distinctive and too central, but also recognizing those things that make human minds different. And they are different. And arguably, this is one of the main differences. And we see it reflected in so many ways, not just in the memes that Richard Dawkins talks about in culture, but in our very language. Other animals have language of some form, at least some of them do, and they certainly communicate. And we will learn more about them, and I'm sure we'll learn more impressive things about them all the time. But it seems unlikely that animal language will have the richness that human language has. And that's certainly given our culture and our sense of self, a sort of open-endedness that we don't see outside of the human species, at least not yet.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Memory is such a weird thing to contemplate. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Have you ever been exposed to remote viewing and how the CIA has programs for that? And there's been a lot of studies on it. What are your thoughts on remote viewing?
I haven't. I haven't been exposed to that at all, so I don't really know what to say about that. I think there are cases like that where it's very hard to understand how it might work. And so there's a maxim often used that extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. So I'm thinking of things like telepathy and so on as well, and telekinesis, these kinds of things that are so challenging to the incomplete picture that we do have. And again, we have to recognize there's doubt and humility and a limit. But science is also incremental, right? It's earlier we said that it'd be very, very hard for someone to demonstrate that the Earth is in fact flat. We would have to be wrong about so much for that to be true. Doesn't mean we're right about everything. So for things like remote viewing and telepathy to be true, it's not merely that we don't understand how it works, we'd have to be wrong about a lot of what we already have a good understanding of. And I think in most of these cases, yes, there are anecdotal examples, but there may be other things going on as well. And so for me, the jury is out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. I've listened to some people on that subject matter, and it starts to make you wonder, because I've spent many hours in flotation tanks and doing a lot of subjective exploration. And I was going to ask you, like, there's obviously a huge rise in your field and in the culture at large in psychedelics, right? And a lot of overhype of it and over promises, and everyone thinks it's going to save the world. And obviously that's not true, because we've seen what happens when everybody starts doing these things. It just amplifies people in certain
No
ways.
single thing is going to save the world, right?
Exactly.
Again, this sort of extremizing of things. It's like we see with AI as well. It's going to save everybody, or it's going to kill everybody. And if you start talking in those terms, you always miss, I think, the relevant nuance of the situation. But yeah, certainly this applies to psychedelics.
Yeah, everybody's got this redemption approach. But have you used psychedelics? And if you don't feel like answering that, I get it.
Yeah, I have. I talk a little bit about it in my book, and I found them absolutely fascinating. I think that there's you said flotation tanks. I spent a few hours in flotation tanks as well, not a ton of hours.
Mm-hmm.
I found those quite interesting, though I do mind wander quite a lot still when I'm there, or fall asleep, which isn't ideal.
Yeah,
just to fall asleep. But with psychedelics, I think there are two angles on it. One is what it can tell us about consciousness. And here, there's two ways you can go with this. One way, and the way I typically go, is that it provides a fascinating opportunity to study consciousness, because a little bit like anesthesia, you expose the brain to a molecule in kind of pretty small concentration, and consciousness changes dramatically. In anesthesia, it goes away, and in psychedelics, it remains, but it changes. And it changes in ways that challenge things we might take otherwise for granted. Your sense of self, your ego might dissolve, and you might realize, it's possible to be conscious without having a very strong, or any, indeed, sense of self, or perhaps space or time or whatever. So I think it's very powerful in revealing the assumptions we might make about how consciousness has to be. And of course, you can then study what happens in the brain too. So you can start connecting the brain to consciousness in a more systematic way. When you're trying to understand a complex system in general, it helps to have many levers you can pull and knobs you can twist and see what happens. And you can think of psychedelics that way. It's just another tool in our toolbox for figuring out, if you do this to the brain, what happens? Mm-hmm. So that's one class of it. And the other class is the therapeutic side, right? And here I think there is a lot of potential, but as you mentioned, there's probably also some amount of over-promising and hopeful thinking, wishful thinking. I think, like many things, it will prove to be very useful, but we have to be very careful not to end up in this kind of pendulum dynamics where everyone gets super excited and it doesn't quite work out, and then the whole thing gets shut down.
Yeah, that seems to be where we're at right now, is the pendulum swung all the way. So hopefully it comes back down to a more centered approach to integrating them into culture. But that's just probably because I've been highly exposed to the conferences and seen the hype, and then it's like, yeah, I get it. There's hype there, and it's such a useful tool for so many people, but there's a lot of big investors, and it's a pretty sticky, weird time for those substances.
Yeah, I think that's the point, isn't it? That there's a lot of money there now, and that can be a great accelerant to a field, mm-hmm. but it is also, by its nature, a distorting factor too.
Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. You got to get going. I'll have one question if you don't mind answering it.
Of course.
If you were going to die today, what would you want to say to the world?
Oh, my word. Thanks. It's been a blast.
I love that. Awesome, Anil. I appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you, Ryan. I appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.